Good evening, friends. Appreciate your devotion and dedication that brings you out on a Sunday evening. It says a lot. It says a lot about you, and I thank you so much for your faith. I do want to encourage us this Thursday night, if we're able, to attend a public study at Kariakis Park. Brother John Lindsay is going to be heading that up as part of the meetup effort. And this is going to be a live event, and we'll be studying the book of Luke. And so grab a neighbor, grab a friend, encourage them to attend, and let the process begin of introducing them to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But let's put forth an effort this week to support that as much as possible. Looking forward to that. This evening, I want to spend a few minutes talking about influence. We understand that influence is defined as the agency or power to affect, to modify or sway. And we understand that. We understand the concept of something being altered because of the presence of something else or obviously someone else. A good illustration is that of a magnet. How it can alter the direction of different objects because of its pull and because of its positivity, we might say, or because of its influence. And we can see that the same concept is applied to God's people, that we have to be careful about what pull the world is having on us. It says in Proverbs 12, you need to be careful about your friends because they're magnets. Good or bad, they're magnets. The righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. Well, leads them astray is referring to influence. Where you had people who would not have taken that path, but because of the presence of their friends, they take the path. They think about it, and they are persuaded to do that. Their direction was altered because of that type of friend. So you have to be very, very careful about the people you keep close company with. Now, we're going to love everybody. We're going to be friends with everybody. That's our task and privilege as God's people. But we're very, very careful about who we let in the inner circle, we might say, and our closest peers and our closest friends. Be very careful because they will have an influence on you. It says in Romans chapter 12 that we have to be people who are not pulled away from God because of the world. Do not be conformed to this world. Well, don't let your direction be altered, we might say. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So overcome that is what he's saying. And it's through our thinking and what we put in our heart and our mind that's going to be the determining factor on how we respond to this world. It just so happens as we were reading Colossians 4 again today, and just hearing it read, it just kind of ties in with what we're looking at tonight. Let me read it for you again. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how to answer each one. That New King James reads a little different than what we read earlier, but you see the concept. If you have a certain type of presence in the world, so that you might have a good influence. And so, like I said, I just want to spend a few minutes looking at this, reminding us of the reality of influence and being people who ask the question, are we being influenced by the world? In what ways are we being influenced? And are we having a positive influence on those who know us? These are good thoughts at any time for us to consider, especially for today. I just want to say one thing in particular, and that is the world does have influence. The world is a magnetic draw for us, and we have to be mindful of that. And the Bible shows us in many ways that God's people can be influenced. We can be affected by the things in the world, the thinking in the world, and so we have to transform our mind. But a great illustration of this is in 1 Kings chapter 11. Because in 1 Kings chapter 11, we're talking about somebody here in the first 8 verses who had more of a personal relationship with God than you will have in this lifetime. God spoke directly to this man. And he was a man who loved God, who gave generously to God in ways that, at levels, at least you and I will never be able to. We can in principle, we can't to the extent that this guy did. He was giving so many resources to the Lord because of his love for God. And so here is a man who genuinely loved God and sought him with all of his heart at one point in his life. But as time went on, the influences in his life pulled him away, altered his direction, modified his faith because of their presence and because of their effect on him. And it says about Solomon that he put himself in that spot. In 1 Kings chapter 11, it says in verse 1, King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites and Ammonites and Edomites, Sidonians and Hittites. From the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princes, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not fully follow the Lord as did his father David. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Now, you know that some of these gods, this was human sacrifice. That's what it's talking about with Molech. Now, how can a man who built the temple of God, first ever on this planet, where you had a physical structure, permanent structure to glorify God, and for God to meet his people, and he did that, loved God, and he went from that conviction to the conviction of building structures to worship false gods. And the reason he did that was because his wives planted those thoughts and desires within his heart. And again, he put himself in that spot because he married these women. But here's an example of somebody whose heart was changed because of the influence of the world. Now, certainly we can see from this that it is supremely important who you marry. Certainly we can see that, right? I mean, that's one of the things God told the people, is that you're not to marry in these other nations because they're going to pull you away from me. Now, I know your intentions are good, your conviction is strong, but given enough time, they will have an influence on you. They will change your thinking. And that's why he told them not to marry from these foreign nations, because of the spiritual impact it would have on their faith. And certainly we can see that in principle, that whoever you marry is going to have a direct impact on your faith. That's just reality. That's timeless. Because we're all made the same way. We're no different than Solomon. We're all made with the same weaknesses and the same struggles. And so the Bible says in Deuteronomy chapter 18 that they were vulnerable. And so God said in verse 9, when you come into the land which the Lord your God has given you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire. Well, that's what Solomon was doing eventually. Or one who practices witchcraft or soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or conjures spells, or medium, or spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. Again, I have no doubt that these things were associated with the pagan worship that Solomon was spearheading. In verse 12, for all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord, and because of these abominations the Lord your God drives them out from before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God, for these nations which you dispossess listened to soothsayers and diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not appointed such for you. So get rid of those influences. Don't even let them in your life, is what God told the Jews. And Solomon is living proof of what God was talking about. Even he had fallen away. That's classic. I mean, that just shows us the power we have over one another. Now, one of the good things that's come out of this pandemic is more people, not everybody, but more people are washing their hands. I like that. I'm a fanatic about that anyway. That's the first thing I do before I leave the church building is I get all your nasty germs off me. I've always been that way. I'm a freak over that, I'll admit. I even keep baby wipes in the console of my car. As soon as I get in, just get that contamination off me. I'm all about that. And it's good that people are more aware of that. More people are washing their hands. Not 100%, but it's better. If you only knew. Guys are disgusting. I'll tell you right now, if you go to a public restroom, guys are nasty. They don't wash their hands. That's why I'm always washing my hands. I'm not saying anything about here. I'm talking about in public. I see that a lot. But it's better than it used to be. But why do we do that? Why do we have to wash our hands? Why can't we just shake hands with a person with clean hands? You know, that if we have dirty hands, just shake hands with someone who's clean, and it's okay. Or if you have grease on your hand or paint, when you shake hands with someone else, does their cleanness rub off on you, or does your filth rub off on them? And we know the obvious. The obvious is that the filth is going to transfer. And what that shows is that's the world we live in. That you cannot surround yourself with filth on a regular basis and not be affected by it. And this can definitely happen from society. You've seen it, I've seen enough. You've seen enough to know our world is changing, and it's changing very quickly. Our society is definitely different than it was just a few decades ago. How can there be confusion on how many genders there are? But that's the world we live in now. There is genuine confusion on that. There is a genuine defiance of law and authority. Who would ever predict that? Where you would have a society that defies the law enforcement. And how there would be sympathy toward tyrannical dictators. Where did all this come from? How come the thinking has changed so drastically in our society? But the point I'm trying to get us to see is the world is decaying, and are you decaying with it? Is that filth rubbing off on you, or are you making a diligent effort to remain distinct and different? You've heard the illustration. It's a really good illustration. Because if you take a frog and you throw it in boiling water, what's going to happen? It's going to jump out of the pot, right? You've heard this illustration 100 times, and I'm going to tell you 101 times because it's a good one. You throw the frog in the hot pot, it's going to jump out, won't stay in. You put it in a pot that is comfortable, room temperature water, and just gradually turn up the heat. And the thing will cook to death and not even realize it. Because the change is happening gradually. And that's what we have to realize about our world, that God is wanting us to realize the temperature is changing. And do we have enough sense to step out of the pot and realize when our faith is being affected? It can be affected. Don't say, not me, can't happen to me. Solomon was a godly man. A godly man. And yet even he was convinced to betray God. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33, you and I have to be aware of this. Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. The filth is going to rub off on you. Goodness doesn't rub off as easily. And so we see the world can have influence. But let me say another thought in light of this, because this is definitely taught in the Bible as well. And that is that we are responsible for how we're being influenced. Now, obviously, God's going to hold us accountable for the influence we have on other people. Certainly, that's part of it. But if the blind lead the blind, It's not just the leader that goes into the ditch, they both fall into the ditch, is what Jesus says, showing that we are accountable for what we let influence us. We are responsible for that. We cannot blame other people for our sin. Now, that's exactly what God wanted his people to know when they went into Babylonian captivity. That as Ezekiel was there among the captives, God told Ezekiel, now you start telling your brethren, stop blaming the people before them. You can't put this all off on other generations. It says in Ezekiel 18 and verse 1 beginning, the word of the Lord came to me saying, what do you mean when you use this proverb concerning the land of Israel, saying, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge? In other words, it's all from our parents. They're the ones who messed up, not us. And so he says, why are you saying this? Why are you people saying this? As I live, says the Lord, you shall no longer use this proverb. Why, God? Because they were responsible for their choices with God's will. And so God says in verse 4, behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins shall die. In other words, you have to take responsibility for what you did in committing idolatry and things like that which led to your captivity. You cannot pin this all on your ancestors, is what he's saying. Because they're saying, look, our fathers ate the sour grapes, but the children's teeth are the ones that are grinding from this. God says, stop saying that. In other words, take responsibility for what you did. And what he does is he shows that each person is accountable for their own choices. You cannot pin this on your parents or your grandparents. He says that if a man decides to be righteous, in verse 5 beginning, if a man is just and does what is lawful and right, if he has not eaten on the mountains, nor lifted up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, nor defiled his neighbor's wife, nor approached a woman during her impurity, if he has not oppressed anyone, but has restored to the debtor his pledge, has robbed no one by violence, but has given his bread to the hungry, and covered the naked with clothing, if he has not exacted usury, nor taken any increase, but has withdrawn his hand from iniquity, and executed true judgment between man and man, if he has walked in my statutes and kept my judgments faithfully, he is just, he shall surely live, says the Lord God. So what he's saying is that you have to realize that God gives each person free will, and that it's up to you how you respond to his will. And if it were not so, how could any of us rise above sin? Because if we have parents who are given to wickedness, and we're not allowed to have our own choice, then how could anybody rise above that? And that's the first thing he says, that if a person decides to do what is right, he's going to live. I'm not going to condemn him, is what God says. And so what he's introducing to them is personal responsibility. And in principle, the same thing is true today. We have to understand that each person gets to make their choice in response to God's will. And that's good or bad, because he says, now what if that righteous man has a wicked son? In verse 10, if he begets a son who is a robber or a shedder of blood, who does any of these things and does none of those duties, but has eaten on the mountains or defiled his neighbor's wife, if he has oppressed the poor and needy, robbed by violence, nor restored the pledge, lifted his eyes to the idols, or committed abomination, if he has exacted usury or taken increase, shall he then live? He shall not live. If he has done any of these abominations, he shall surely die. His blood shall be upon him. And so God's saying that it should be clear to you that righteousness doesn't transfer. Now, we may be affected by our parents' choices, especially physically. I'm confident that happens when you have parents who are given to criminal activity, drug abuse, things like that. It's going to affect the family as a whole. But guilt is only applied to those who choose to violate God's will. And that's what he's showing here, that if a man chooses to do right, God will bless him. If his son decides to do evil, the father's goodness doesn't rub off, right? The child is responsible for his own filth, and God holds him accountable. We each get to decide, because he takes it one step farther. Because if that wicked son has a righteous son, God gives that righteous grandchild his own opportunity to do what is right. And the same thing is repeated in principle regarding that grandson. That he shall not die for the iniquity of his father. He shall surely live, as it says in verse 17. And what this shows is that God is a God who is just and fair and merciful. But he holds us accountable. He holds us accountable for what influence we let enter our life and affect us. Nobody can say, I can't help it. My family's always been this way. We've always been given to these types of practices. I can't help it. And God would say in a text like this is, yes, you can help it. It is your choice. And it is your responsibility how you let this world influence you in response to God's will. And that leads to one final point. Because we're talking about the reality of influence. And so this definitely should lead us to this conclusion, I think. Because this is a powerful feature we have as people, to influence one another. And if that's reality, and it is true, shouldn't we use that ability for the glory of God? Shouldn't we use that ability to pull people to God, to draw them closer to the Lord because of our light and because of our example and because of our influence? I know of a family in Texas who had a nursery business, still do, but they were doing well. And one of the employees there was eventually converted to the Lord. But she said, when this happened, is that she said, I want what they have. And she was talking about their manner of life because they just stood out to her. That she could see these were genuinely good, godly people who loved God and who had faith in him. And I have no doubt that they did not do that to impress her. They did that out of conviction. But her faith was shaped and she was pulled to the Lord because of their influence and because of their example. You have that ability. Do you realize that? You have the ability to bring someone to the Lord by your manner of life, by your example of faith. Or, obviously, we can be people who pull people away from God, as the wives of Solomon did with him. But obviously, we should use this ability to bring people to the Lord. You're influencing somebody. Somebody's life is altered because of your presence. And so let us be mindful of that and use it for the glory of God. That's what Peter says to godly women in 1 Peter chapter 3. And I bet if I asked you, don't do it, but raise of hands, who in here is serving God because of the influence of a godly woman? And I'm sure there's quite a few of us who would raise our hands. And that's what Peter is talking about. Now, he's not saying that if your husband or your family is not converted to the Lord, it's your fault. That's not what he is implying by this. But what he is saying is that if God is going to use you to bring someone to him, you have to be genuine in your faith and in your commitment to him, because he can use that influence to persuade people to live for him. 1 Peter chapter 3 says this in verses 1 and 2, Wives, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. That's saying your family's watching. And if they don't serve God, they're watching you in professing to serve God. And when they see you week after week after week after week sacrificing your time to put the Lord first in attending, or the Lord first in studying his word day after day after day, that you sincerely, genuinely pray and you walk with God, you may not realize it, but you're letting a beacon shine through your example. And if they are inclined to have a heart open to God's will, that is going to come about because of your influence and because of your example. That's powerful. That is really powerful. I read the story of a man who thought he died and was on his way to torment. And it was real to him. And all the fear, you know what things are associated with that, the flames, the darkness, the evil creatures there that the Bible talks about. But he said in his account, one of the things that bothered him most was that he had to look at his influence on other people. That what his example was doing to dissuade other people from living for God. That is a sobering thing to think about. And how fortunate he was to have that dream. What kind of influence are you having? What things are you endorsing in life? You know, I think something like this has to be repeated quite often in our day and time because we have so many ways of expressing ourselves. We do. And we can express ourselves instantaneously nowadays. Around the world, people can hear our thoughts. The world is definitely smaller than it used to be, and it's only getting smaller. I mean, you can say something on social media tonight that will be heard and thought about around the world. That's the ability we have nowadays. And if that's reality, then we have to be people who use that very, very carefully. Before you endorse anything on social media, you need to think about the impact it's going to have on other people. I am very careful about what I support. I do not want to support alcohol. I don't want to support adultery. I don't want to support licentious behavior and all things tied in with that. I don't want to support those who are teaching false doctrine. I'm not going to give thumbs up for things like that. And if you see that I have done that, I beg of you to contact me, because if that's the case, I did not do it intentionally, and I need to realize the things I support. But you have that ability. You realize that when people see your thumbs up on a post that's endorsing alcohol or endorsing adulterous marriage or endorsing false doctrine on salvation, when they see you giving a thumbs up, how is it going to bring that about? How are people going to be won to the Lord when we're endorsing things that violate God's will? And so we have to be careful. We have to be careful who recognize the power of our influence. And as he says here in this context, you can win people to the Lord when you are genuinely, sincerely godly every day. May God give us the wisdom to see that. I know there's more that can and should be said, but I wanted to share these few thoughts with us this evening. Influence is real. It really is. And that we can be influenced by the world. We have to be careful. We're responsible for what things we let influence us and people who influence us. And then we should use our influence to magnify God and His will. Thank you, friends. I appreciate your commitment so much. It could be that you're here, you're not a child of God. We always like to give people an opportunity to obey the gospel. If you understand that, why not tonight? It's a perfect night to be saved from sin. If you understand that and you're ready to enter the body of Christ, we compel you to do that. If you need to make things right with God in any way, even publicly, please do so as we stand and sing.